She was invisible until the moment her words made millionaires weep. What happened next would shatter every assumption about who deserves to dream. The Beverly Hills Cafe hummed with the predictable rhythm of designer handbags clicking against marble tables and the soft whisper of $100 bills changing hands. Keela Ward moved between the tables like a shadow, her black uniform blending into the dark corners where the wealthy preferred their service to remain unseen. The weight of the coffee pot in her left hand had become as familiar as breathing, while her right hand clutched a small notebook, her lifeline to a world beyond these gilded walls. The morning air carried the scent of overpriced vanilla lattes and the sharp bite of fresh money. Keela's worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she navigated between conversations about trust funds and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Her braided hair was pulled back tightly, professional and unobtrusive, the way management preferred. The customer's eyes slid past her like water off glass. She was furniture with legs, a mechanism for delivering caffeine and clearing plates. But in the stolen moments between orders, when the breakfast rush ebbed and the lunch crowd hadn't yet arrived, Keila would pull out her notebook. Her pen moved across the pages with quiet urgency, capturing fragments of the story that lived inside her head. A story about a girl who looked like her, who saved the future, who mattered. Brianna Hartwell noticed the notebook first. The 22-year-old heiress sat at table 12, her platinum credit card gleaming beside a barely touched gluten-free muffin. Her father owned half of downtown LA, and she wore that privilege like expensive perfume, invisible to her, overwhelming to everyone else. Her perfectly straightened blonde hair caught the California sunlight, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and her manicured fingers tapped impatiently against her iPhone case. "Excuse me," Brianna's voice cut through the cafe's gentle murmur. "What are you writing?" Keila looked up, her pen freezing mid-sentence. The notebook felt suddenly heavy in her hands, as if it contained state secrets instead of science fiction. "I'm sorry? That little book you keep scribbling in. Are you writing down our conversations? Taking notes for gossip blogs?" Brianna's laugh was crystalline and sharp. "Or maybe you're composing memes for TikTok." The other customers at nearby tables began to turn their heads. Keila felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the same burn she'd felt in elementary school when classmates mocked her secondhand clothes, in high school when guidance counselors suggested she pursue more realistic career paths. "It's my book," she said quietly. "Science fiction." The words hung in the air for a moment before Brianna's laughter erupted like champagne from a shaken bottle. The sound bounced off the marble walls and seemed to multiply, drawing more stares, more smirks from the cafe's patrons. "Science fiction?" Brianna wiped at her eyes with a tissue that probably cost more than Keela's hourly wage. "Oh, honey, the only fiction here is you thinking anyone would want to read about." She gestured vaguely at Keela's appearance. "About someone like you on a book cover." The notebook slipped from Keela's fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Pages fluttered open, revealing her careful handwriting, her sketched diagrams of spaceships and alien worlds. A few customers leaned forward, craning their necks to see what had caused such amusement. "Brianna, that's enough." The voice came from table 15, where Marcus Chen sat with his laptop open and his coffee growing cold. He was 35, sharp-featured, with the kind of quiet authority that came from building tech companies from the ground up. His venture capital firm had offices on 3 continents, but today he was just another customer in an expensive suit. Marcus had been watching Keila for weeks, not in the way men usually watched attractive women, but with the focused attention of someone who recognized hidden potential. He'd noticed how she moved efficiently through the cafe's chaos, how she remembered every regular's order without writing it down, how her eyes lit up when she glanced at that mysterious notebook. "I'm just having fun," Brianna said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "She can take a joke, can't you, honey?" Keila bent to retrieve her notebook, her hands shaking slightly. The pages felt fragile, as if Brianna's laughter had somehow damaged the words written there. She straightened up, her jaw set in a line Marcus recognized, the expression of someone who'd been underestimated their entire life. "I need to get back to work," Keila said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The afternoon shift passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Keila mechanically took orders, delivered food, cleared tables, all while replaying Brianna's words in her head. By closing time, her feet ached and her heart felt bruised, but she couldn't shake the memory of the man at table 15, the way he'd looked at her notebook, not with mockery, but with something that might have been curiosity. Marcus waited in the parking lot as Keela emerged from the staff entrance, her uniform replaced by jeans and a faded UCLA sweatshirt. The California evening was warm, carrying the scent of jasmine from the landscaped planters that surrounded the cafe. "Keela, right," he said, stepping out of the shadows near a black Tesla. "I'm Marcus Chen. I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier." She tensed, expecting another round of humiliation. "If you're here to make jokes about my book..." "Actually, I wanted to ask you about it." "Science fiction, you said?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody had ever asked about her writing with genuine interest. Her family thought it was a waste of time. Her coworkers assumed it was a hobby, and customers like Brianna treated it as a punchline. "It's about a girl who discovers she can manipulate quantum fields," Keela said slowly, as if testing the words aloud. "She lives in a world where Earth's climate has collapsed, and the wealthy have escaped to orbital stations while everyone else struggles with the heat and storms. But she figures out how to restore the planet's atmosphere." Marcus leaned against his car, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds remarkably sophisticated. Have you studied physics?" "Online courses, mostly. Massachusetts Institute of Technology has free lectures on quantum mechanics. I've been working on this story for 3 years, researching every night after my shifts." She paused, then added quietly, "I know it probably sounds ridiculous coming from someone like me." "Someone like you? A black girl who didn't go to college, who serves coffee for a living?" The words came out bitter, flavored with years of being told to know her place. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the amber glow of the parking lot lights. "Can I tell you something? I dropped out of Stanford my sophomore year to start my first company. My parents didn't speak to me for 6 months. Everyone said I was throwing my life away." He smiled. "Sometimes the most important voices are the ones nobody expects to hear." Keela felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was there. "You really think so?" "I think talent doesn't care about your zip code or your bank account. It just cares about passion and persistence." He pulled out his phone. "Would you be willing to send me a few chapters? I'm always looking for fresh perspectives, and I have some connections in publishing." The notebook felt different in her hands that night as she walked to her studio apartment 6 blocks away. The same words were written on the same pages, but somehow they carried more weight, more possibility. She thought about Brianna's laughter, about the way the other customers had stared, about all the times she'd been told to dream smaller, aim lower, accept less. But she also thought about Marcus's question, asked without mockery or condescension, "Would you be willing to send me a few chapters?" As she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, Keela made a decision. She would send him the chapters. She would stop apologizing for her ambitions. And she would prove that stories, real, important stories, could come from anywhere, written by anyone brave enough to pick up a pen. The city lights twinkled beyond her small window as she opened her laptop and began to type. Somewhere across town, Brianna was probably at another exclusive party, surrounded by people who looked just like her, talking about things that mattered only to people who'd never had to fight for anything. But here, in this cramped apartment that smelled faintly of the neighbors' cooking and old carpet, Keela was building worlds. Marcus kept his promise. Within a week, he'd forwarded her chapters to Rachel Morrison, a literary agent who specialized in diverse voices in speculative fiction. Rachel called on a Thursday evening, her voice crackling through Keela's ancient flip phone. "Your quantum field theory is solid," Rachel said without preamble. "Your character development is compelling, and your world building." She paused. "Where did you learn to write like this?" "I didn't learn," Keela said, pacing her tiny kitchen. "I just wrote what I saw in my head." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I want to represent you." The call lasted 45 minutes. By the end, Keela had an agent, a publication timeline, and a book deal with a major science fiction imprint. The advance was modest, enough to quit her job at the cafe and focus on writing full-time, but not enough to buy a house in Beverly Hills. Still, as she hung up the phone, Keela felt something she'd never experienced before, the solid certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She gave her 2 weeks' notice the next morning. Her manager, a perpetually stressed woman named Linda, barely looked up from the schedule she was updating. "Good luck with whatever," Linda muttered. "We'll need to find someone to cover your shifts." Keela cleaned out her locker, folding her uniform for the last time. The fabric felt strange in her hands, no longer a costume she had to wear, but simply clothing she was choosing to leave behind. She tucked her notebook into her bag and walked out through the front entrance, past the tables where she'd served thousands of cups of coffee, past table 12 where Brianna had laughed at her dreams. The next 18 months passed in a blur of editing sessions, marketing meetings, and promotional events. Dust Over Atlantis hit the shelves on a Tuesday in March, with Keela's face prominently displayed on the cover, exactly as she'd envisioned her protagonist, but unmistakably herself. The reviews were stellar. The sales exceeded all expectations. Within 3 months, it had climbed to number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. Brianna discovered the book by accident, browsing in the Beverly Hills Barnes & Noble while killing time before a yoga class. She was flipping through the new releases when she saw the display. Debut of the year, Dust Over Atlantis by Keela Ward. The photograph showed a young black woman with natural hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a simple black dress and a confident smile. Something about the face looked familiar. Brianna picked up the book, studying the author photo more closely. The woman looked like... No, it couldn't be. But as she read the brief biography on the back cover, Keela Ward worked as a waitress while writing her debut novel. The memory came flooding back. The notebook, the laughter, the way the girl had looked when her dreams hit the floor. "Oh my God," Brianna whispered. She bought the book. She couldn't explain why, but she bought it and read it in one sitting, curled up in her father's study while he worked late in his downtown office. The story was brilliant, complex, moving, scientifically rigorous, and deeply human. The protagonist's journey from powerlessness to purpose resonated in ways Brianna hadn't expected, making her think about her own life, her own assumptions, her own careless cruelties. When she finished, she sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the girl she'd mocked, the dreams she'd dismissed, the talent she'd been too blind to see. The book signing at the Beverly Hills Library was packed. Keela sat behind a table stacked with copies of her novel, wearing the same simple black dress from her author photo. She looked poised, professional, and completely at ease as she answered questions about quantum physics, climate change, and the responsibility of science fiction to imagine better futures. Brianna stood at the back of the crowd, clutching her copy of the book. She'd been debating whether to approach the signing table, whether to say something, whether an apology could possibly matter after all this time. But as she listened to Keela speak, articulate, passionate, brilliant, she realized that her opinion had never mattered much to begin with. "The most important thing about science fiction," Keela was saying in response to a question from a high school student, "is that it gives us permission to imagine that things can be different, better. That problems can be solved, that voices can be heard, that people who've been invisible can become the heroes of their own stories." An older woman in the front row raised her hand. "What advice would you give to young writers who don't think they have the right background for this genre?" Keela smiled, and Brianna caught a glimpse of the quiet girl who'd served coffee and written stories in secret. "I'd tell them that there is no right background. There's only passion, persistence, and the courage to put your truth on the page. Some people will tell you that your story doesn't matter, that your voice doesn't belong in certain spaces." Her eyes swept across the crowd, perhaps landing on Brianna for just a moment. "But they're wrong. The world needs your story. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The applause was thunderous. Brianna found herself clapping too, her eyes burning with tears she didn't fully understand. She didn't get in line for the signing. Instead, she slipped out the back door and sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at the book in her lap. On the dedication page, Keela had written, "For everyone who's been told they don't belong here, this is for you." 3 months later, Netflix announced they'd acquired the film rights to Dust Over Atlantis for an undisclosed sum that entertainment reporters estimated in the mid-7 figures. Keela was named as executive producer, with significant creative control over the adaptation. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, trending on social media within hours. Brianna saw it on her Instagram feed while sitting in the same cafe where it had all started. Table 12 was occupied by a different entitled rich girl, but the marble floors were the same. The vanilla lattes were the same, and the invisible people in black uniforms were still moving through the space like ghosts. She thought about Keela's face on magazine covers, about the movie that would soon introduce her story to millions of people around the world, about the recognition and respect and success that had bloomed from seeds planted in secrecy and watered with determination. And she thought about her own life, the trust fund she'd never earned, the opportunities that had been handed to her, the talent she'd never had to develop because she'd never had to fight for anything. For the first time in her privileged existence, Brianna wondered if she had anything meaningful to contribute to the world, anything that couldn't be bought with her father's money. The question haunted her long after she'd finished her overpriced coffee and driven home to her empty mansion in the hills. Keela's success continued to snowball. Dust Over Atlantis was translated into 23 languages. The Netflix adaptation became the most watched science fiction series in the platform's history. Keela used her newfound influence to establish a foundation that provided grants and mentorship to aspiring writers from underrepresented backgrounds. At the foundation's first annual gala, held in the ballroom of a downtown LA hotel, Keela stood before an audience of agents, publishers, studio executives, and celebrities. She wore a midnight blue gown that transformed her from the invisible waitress she'd once been into someone who commanded attention simply by existing. 2 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. I was serving coffee to people who looked right through me. They saw my uniform, my skin color, my circumstances, and they decided that was all there was to see. They were wrong. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. Somewhere in the back, barely visible in the dim lighting, Brianna sat at a purchased table, listening to every word. But I'm not here to talk about them, Keela continued. I'm here to talk about us, about everyone who's been underestimated, overlooked, or told their dreams are too big for their circumstances. We are here. We have always been here. And we're not going anywhere. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Keela remained at the podium, steady and graceful, as hundreds of people celebrated not just her success, but the possibilities she represented. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the hotel staff began clearing the ballroom, Keela found herself alone for the first time in hours. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In her hand, she held a small object, her original notebook, the same one that had fallen to the floor of the Beverly Hills Cafe under the weight of someone else's laughter. The pages were worn now, soft from handling, filled with the first drafts of stories that had become books, movies, movements. She opened it to a random page and read her own handwriting from 3 years ago. She discovered that her power wasn't in being seen by others, but in finally seeing herself clearly. Keela smiled, tucking the notebook back into her purse. Tomorrow, there would be more interviews, more meetings, more opportunities to change the world one story at a time. But tonight, she was content to stand in the quiet darkness, surrounded by the warm glow of her own making, knowing that she had kept every promise she'd ever made to herself. The city hummed below her, full of invisible people with untold stories, and Keela whispered a quiet vow to the glass. May they all find their voices sooner than I found mine. In the end, talent recognizes no boundaries. It flows where it will, seeds itself in the most unlikely soil, and blooms despite every attempt to cut it down. Remember this story the next time you're tempted to look past someone whose dreams seem too big for their circumstances. You might be missing the next voice that changes everything.